Welcome to Faster Please, the podcast. I'm your host, Jim Pethokoukis, and my guest today is Shuting Pomerleau. She's the Director of Energy and Environmental Policy at the American Action Forum. And today we are going to talk about data centers. Let's begin with New York Governor Kathy Hochul's decision to pause construction of very, very big data centers in New York, at least for a year. What problem is that moratorium supposed to solve? And is a pause in construction, is that a proportionate response in your view?
Thanks for the question. This is really timely. For those of us who are paying really close attention to the AI and data center electricity market field, it was not really a surprise. Recall that last month, Maine almost passed a moratorium on data centers as well, but the governor vetoed it. So from my perspective, I think this 1 year pause of new construction of very large data centers, more than 50 megawatts, is supposed to, well, officially they said they wanted more time to study the reliability, the impact on their customers. They want more time to rolling out more thoughtful frameworks in terms of addressing the huge soaring AI demand. Um, that is what they claim that they want to solve. In my opinion, the sentiment is really not only here in Virginia. I live in Virginia, across the country. A lot of people are opposing data centers. I started doing research on data centers last summer. Just within 1 year, the sentiment across the United States towards data centers has changed a lot. So, notably, the moratorium is only applicable to new construction projects. Anything that have been approved, permitted, currently they have hit the ground under construction, those won't be affected.
So there, there,
So,
there will be new
if
data centers being built in New York over the next year.
Yes. And there's quite a bit of that in the pipeline. If you look at across the country, obviously Virginia is the first tier market. New York is considered a second tier market. A lot of data center developers, they may not prioritize that, but it is quite attractive given the condensed businesses and population in that state. My concern is that pausing this will send a very strong signal to investors, data center developers, almost like a chilling signal, like, or you're not really welcome here. This is such a fast moving space. 1 year is actually a lot of time if you think about the competition, what it takes to build things, connect to the grid, and find customers for your data centers.
Uh, I certainly understand thinking about this in sort of the political context where AI seems to be, very unpopular, and data centers are viewed as sort of an obvious manifestation of AI that people can sort of see and protest. But there is like a real thing happening. Just to focus, we'll set aside the stuff about water. Let's just focus on like electricity. Like prices are going up. They're going up nationally, and they're going up, I guess, maybe more on the East Coast. To what extent on the East Coast or New York specifically can you blame, like as of like right now and over the past 2 years, that data centers have driven that price increase?
That's a very great question, James. So historically, up to say of now, there has been electricity prices increase. If you look at the electricity market, both at the state level and nationally, it has remained relatively flat over the last couple of decades. Just starting from 2025 and this year, if you look at a nominal prices level for these areas, the electricity prices have indeed increased relatively fast, especially in the residential sector compared to industrial and commercial. Now, there are plenty of credible studies out there. The literature tells us that the price increases in the residential sector was not driven by AI data centers. If you think about the electricity market, there are three components: generation, transmission, transmitting the electricity over long distances. Distribution is really going the last mile, delivering the electricity to, say, a rural house in the middle of nowhere. So, what has been really driving the electricity increases, mostly in the residential sector, is the local distribution system. The maintenance, repairs, upgrades that cost a lot of money. So it was almost like a coincidence with the AI data center boom and the sentiment against AI, and we see the electricity prices. But if you really look into the real price level changes, it's still quite flat, both at the state level and across the country.
But it seems like it's been higher on the East Coast. That I mean, that's my perception. Is that right?
Yes. So it's the price increases are much faster in states like Maine and California that really stand out, and on the East Coast too, especially the states sitting under the Regional Transmission Organization (PJM). I for the listeners who are paying attention, sometimes it pops up. It's referring to the Regional Transmission Organization covering 13 states. The full name
But
is
not New York.
Pennsylvania, Jersey,
Not New York's
Maryland.
not in that, right?
Not New York. Not New York. New York is its own thing. New York independent operating system. So these states have huge AI data center demand. Um, we have aging infrastructure. If you look at a lot of the thermal baseload power plants, coal and natural gas, they're retiring faster, and a lot of the new projects, say solar, wind, new natural gas power plants, it takes them quite a few years to be connected to the grid to be able to bring electrons to the grid. PJM is its own mess. I've been hearing a lot of challenges.
I get if you want. I think a sympathetic view toward that this decision by the New York governor would be this. You're right. Like that there's a lot of investment that need to be done. We have aging infrastructure, and maybe to some degree there's a bit of a coincidence that these data centers have come online and electricity prices have gone up. But there's going to be a lot more data centers, and they're going to use a lot more power. And going forward, they're probably going to they're going to need a lot more energy, and we're going to have to build more, and we have to, spend even more on infrastructure. So going forward, there's going to be an impact on prices. So maybe we need to pause and we need to figure it out. And even setting aside some of the maybe potential environmental impacts, we have to figure out like how we want to pay for this. Should the companies be playing a role? Should I put a tax on the? So I mean, I guess that would be the sympathetic view that there's going to be this increasing demand. It's going to cause prices to go up, and we have to sort of pause and figure it out. I mean, that would be sort of taking her at her word. And if I take her at her word, would the pause be the best way to deal with this uncertainty and I guess the certainty of greater demand?
My short answer is no. I think a better approach would be to, if you're really worried about a lot of the huge data centers, more than 50 megawatts, applying to be in the pipeline, you could do some regulatory tweaks and say maybe we'll need to put in more requirements to study the feasibility rather than a blanket ban. Now, with this 1 year pause, I'm quite skeptical that it will actually do anything to solve the issues in New York State fundamentally. If you really look at the emissions regulation for the state, it's really a hodgepodge patchwork of climate regulations.
What occurred to me is like, if she's worried about electricity prices, just tell these companies either you have to either build your own power or you have to pay us money. Like that to me would be like the simple explanation, the simple move, rather than we need to pause and think about it.
Yeah, exactly. In Virginia, they actually passed a new electricity rate class for hyperscalers like large data centers at the end of last year to be effective starting in the beginning of 2027. What it says is if you're certain large scalers above certain threshold of demand, you need to be paying at least 80% of the contracted demand in terms of transmission and distribution costs, and 60% of the generation. Now, is 80 and 60 really calculated based on science? I don't think so. It's more like arts. But like with the politics and policy, you could go in and say, all right, guys, you can build data centers here, but we really need more transparency and see how much cost you're shifting or not shifting to our residential customers.
And it also, and maybe this will play into some of the difficulty maybe in building these things and some of the climate rules. It also occurred to me that one, in New York State, I think like they just either shut down like a nuclear reactor. There's the, I guess, the Indian Point nuclear plant. They're not going to restart that nuclear reactor. So it seems to me like that's on the state. And more broadly, if you have not been doing sort of what you should as a state to make sure you have sort of a modern electrical grid. And I realize that power demand has gone up a lot lately, but as like, isn't that what government is supposed to do? Like that's a public good, being able to have an infrastructure that can supply adequate energy, preferably clean energy, for business. It seems to me that like the state has not done that. They won't reopen a nuclear reactor, and it seems to me that all the focus here is on what the company should be doing or not doing, and the state has sort of thrown up its hands and saying that like it's not our job to do that, and you need to pay a tax or higher rates or something. So I mean that's sort of my simple like knee jerk version is like what the state has the state has failed here.
Yeah, so I think you're spot on here, Jim. So in terms of the data centers thing, I think as one of the many types of hyperscaler, large demand customers, it does get excessive scrutiny, especially over the last couple of months. I think politically, it's easier to pick a target and say, you guys are not welcome here. But to your point about the state doing its responsibility about making sure there's enough electricity on the grid. So, like three things again: generation. Are you really allowing as many, preferably clean but affordable, energy sources to be able to generate electricity in the state? The answer is no. They have very, very stringent climate regulations. New York is in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, multiple state cap and trade emissions program. Not only that, they have a very strict clean power net zero emissions target by certain years. On top of that, they also have a certain procurement target. We have to have this many gigawatts of solar and wind by this year. If you look at it, it's really arbitrary and heavy-handed, state regulated. It's not really letting the market doing its job. We're not setting a framework or principle approach to allow as many energy sources onto the grid as possible. So that's the generation side. Transmission, we talk about permitting reform a lot in this country. That's really a complex issue at the federal and state, local issues. It's the state investing enough transmission lines to bring power from the generation sources to the customers and local distribution. So I do not think the data centers is the only factor here contributing 100% of the potential problems. I kind of think it's kind of a scapegoat, like a high profile moratorium. I'm skeptical how much it's gonna do. Maybe it will just deter a lot of the future investment in New York State.
I think you can accept going forward that um, if we're going to build a lot more data centers, they're going to use a lot more energy, and someone has to pay for that. And I know there's two ideas that have popped up. Maybe they preceded this pause in New York. Maybe they are about the same time. There's one idea which is to create a federal rate freeze where utilities would pause rate hikes in exchange for access to cheap federal credit and expedited permitting. That's one idea. I think both these tend to be sort of left of center ideas. And the other idea is imposing an excise tax on data centers investment, with the proceeds of that tax going toward modernizing the power grid, building more transmission lines, transformers. So one, there's kind of like a rate freeze since we're worried about rates, and an access for cheap credit to modernize the grid, and the other one is a tax to finance the modernization. Any of those ideas seem attractive to you, assuming I've explained them in adequate detail?
Yeah, so the first proposal, a rate freeze in exchange of something the federal government can get to the states, I don't think that's a good idea. Just like housing, the housing crisis, freezing rent is not going to increase your supply. Freezing electricity rates is definitely not the right way to encourage more generation and bringing the electron to the grid. Now, I've heard that there are some arguments saying, well, this is not a simple rate freeze. It's you freeze the rate in exchange for some funding and permitting. It goes back to my point about permitting reform. It's such a complex issue. There's very limited things at a federal level that they can do. So, FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, they regulate interstate commerce in transmission. Maybe they participated in the wholesale market, but most of the retail electricity sales is within the states. So yes, if something is completely within the state's authority, maybe the permitting the federal cannot help much at all. It's really up to the state authority. If they really try to meddle with the affairs, it'll open up a lot of vulnerabilities to litigation. So first idea, I don't think it's a good idea. The second idea, Virginia actually started doing. It passes one of its kind first, whatever you call it, energy tax on AI data centers. It's about 11 cents per kilowatt. It's the first tax like that across the entire country. Now, what's interesting is the context of that tax was they had a huge budget fight at the state government. Some Democratic senators or lawmakers, they disagree with the further expansion of data centers, so they have a huge hole in the budget they need to fill, about 11 cents, and they say, well, for every kilowatt you use, we'll put a tax on it up to 600 million, and then we'll stop. And they haven't really decided how to use the funding. I think it might go to the general fund, but this is one of many ideas to try to get data centers to pay for their quote unquote fair share, right? Like, what is a fair share? And that is a question has always been on my mind. The data centers are not all sitting there across the country doing their own thing separate from the remaining of the population. They're providing digital services and great services for us, you and me, using AI. So, what is a fair share? How can they pay for exactly how much they use? I think the tax is one of the angle. There are many other ideas that there, and if you really want to compare the two, I think maybe the second one is if the data centers are willing to pay and then you tax them, that's a fine idea. But how about if you pause the sales tax exemption for these data centers? There's a lot of states marketing it as a preferential treatment or incentive for investment. So because the electricity market is very complex, it's hard to imagine that if you have a big pot of money coming out of the data centers, you can for sure use that money to improve the grid, transmission, distribution, and lower residential bills. So there are too many factors out there. And depending on how you use that money, I don't think it's a very straightforward, simple issue.
Well, someone's got, so there needs to be, assuming we're going to keep building these data centers and people are going to find a value for artificial intelligence, who ultimately, like, so I guess you've kind of answered this, but just to be clear, so who should pay and how do they pay?
So that's a great question. I think who should pay and how do they pay? So I have a little bit background expertise in tax. So like I think of it as statutory and effective, right? Statutory, I think the entity that directly need to pay for the power is definitely the data centers. I mean, they are the infrastructures or facilities that are consuming a lot of the energy. So whoever owns these data centers should be directly responsible for the payment of the electricity they consume. But who will be paying for it? That's a great question. These companies like Google, Facebook, Meta, Amazon, they have customers and users, whether that's businesses or consumers like you and me, and they operate in a free market, in a market competition, so they can pass on the increased cost to their consumers. So that's another question. But it seems to me in the debate of AI data centers and electricity
Shooting,
is
shooting.
more
There's no
about the
such thing as a free
statutory.
lunch. There's no such thing as a free
Who's
lunch. Someone's got to
paying?
pay.
Yes, who's paying on the paper? I think the discussion is more about that, in my opinion.
Also, I mean, another bit of context is there's sort of this assumption that certainly I think it has been promoted by some sort of anti-data center activists that these big warehouses are built. We stuff them with computers. They use a lot of water. They use a lot of electricity. There's like one security guard or something who works at these warehouses, and they don't supply any actual economic benefits to the area. That is certainly not true, but it seems the economic benefits they directly provide, other than digital services, but tax revenue to the area, like that seems to be really neglected.
Yeah, I would say that that sentiment, the opposition to AI data centers, is probably one of the biggest pieces of misinformation out there, right? It is true if you think about actual headcounts of jobs created. They do create a lot more jobs in the initial construction phase of these data centers. They hire construction companies, electricians, hook up everything. And then once you're done, you have all the computers running there 24/7. But I think the right way to look at it is these are businesses, they're paying taxes, they're paying property taxes. If you look at Loudoun County, which is really the hub of Virginia Data Center Alley, it holds about 80% of the data centers for the Commonwealth. I think Wall Street Journal had a op-ed out this week saying about 90% of the county's operating budget comes from data centers. Now, you and I can here sitting and debate whether it's a good thing to put so many eggs in one basket and depend on one sector so heavily for the budget. But they say if all the data centers were to disappear tomorrow, the average household would be required to pay $5,800 to receive the same level and quality public services. I think the right way to think about it is what sort of a regulatory and investment environment does your state or local county want to project for businesses? Um, they're companies selling goods and services to end customers. They're not just walking around corporations. We all use their goods and services. So I think it's important to think about that from that perspective and not fall from these very emotional narratives against AI data centers.
Back in February, I was reading a report from Goldman Sachs, and that report argued that local moratoriums and all this regulatory pushback was unlikely to slow data center growth. To what extent is this going to limit the number of data centers we build going forward?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. I think of the AI data center boom in the United States as a fast moving train. It's going to move, it's going to happen. I think the New York State's moratorium, some of the local opposition across the countries may slow down some of the application of development, but not very significantly. I think what will have a material impact on the pace of AI data center development is all the discussion about who's paying for it, how much should they be paying for it, are they paying enough of it, will really drive the discussion between utilities, federal, state regulators, and data center developers and consumers really weed out some of the not so serious developments, unless I'm really ready to pay for how much is considered fair share. I'm not going to call up, say, PJM and say, hey, study my project's feasibility to be connected to the grid. So I think that may have some positive effects, like making sure everything that's announced, say 10 gigawatt, is really going to be realized. I think that might have some of the material effects. The moratorium, I don't really expect a lot more states are going to follow suit. There may be a couple more, but I would be surprised if Virginia, say, right, the data center alley, who hosts 70% of the entire world's internet traffic, would have a moratorium next month. Then we'll probably have to have another podcast discuss why we got it wrong. But I don't think so. I think it won't slow down that much.
Uh, if you had to give like one bit of policy advice to a to a senator and one bit of policy advice to a governor, what would those two bits of policy advice be regarding data center regulation?
Senator and governor.
Yeah. So one federal, one
Um,
more state level.
yeah, I think for the senator is really understanding how the electricity market works and be very careful about the federal state authority. You don't want to create more litigations and put things in a more dire situation. Right now, it takes a couple years to connect a new generating source like a solar wind power plant to the grid, or for a large load data centers to be connected to the grid. That's several years. So for governor, I think the advice is it's a very difficult job right now. I understand for any governor, especially when it comes to AI data centers, you need to really think about prioritizing. I understand the political requirements. You need to appease some of your constituents, your opponents, but whether you're prioritizing environmental regulations, we talk about that, or economic development, or just some political gestures, and then like midterm is coming, you want to do something that's perceived as popular but may have long-term unintended consequences. It's not easy.
My advice to Washington would be to pass permitting reform, make it easier to build stuff in this country.
Yeah, I think many people will agree with you 100%.
And I was going to ask this earlier, but let me ask it now. Would it be better if all these data centers just brought their own power? Maybe they can't do it right now, but whether it's building, whether it's natural gas turbines, or I don't know, in 5 years maybe it's small modular reactors. Should they just, would that be like a good solution if technically possible?
Yeah, so that's been discussed a lot. It's called like off the grid, bring your own power. So the biggest challenge is the electricity market, the utility sector is a heavily regulated, very complex market. It's completely different from your everyday competitive market. A lot of these tech giants like Google and Meta, they're doing what they are best at, right? Which is innovation, technological development, AI race. They don't necessarily want to be in the utility sector. Energy sector, energy market, it's a whole completely different sector. It's you need to deal with fuels, fossil fuels, as opposed to new renewable energy, going through the local, state, and
They would
federal
they would they
regulations.
would rather get it from the grid if possible.
Yes, and also there's another important component is uh, efficiency and technological advancement, right? They might consume so much power right now that it warrants investment in a natural gas power plant. And mind you, I think Bloomberg and EF had a study out earlier this year saying that even if you look at a natural gas power plant, it is 60% more expensive than previously to build a natural gas power plant because of the supply chain and the turbines and all the tariffs and regulations. It's not easy. It's not like I can just bring my own power and build power plants. It takes at least several years, and you're gonna get the approval from all the utilities. And also, the wind, natural gas turbines has a huge delay. If you were order one today, you might get one in 5 years if you're lucky. So it's not that easy. And as the data centers get more efficient, they may consume less energy, they may consume less water. If we do have the technology where if you have excess uh, energy or electricity, say you have solar panel or solar wall in your house, you are able to sell some of the electricity back to the grid. You may add some money or get some credits for future electricity bills. So I think there are a lot of considerations here. And because of the permitting challenges in the United States, it may add at least a couple of years if they want to bring their own power, and that will delay their timeline significantly.
My last question, for this not to be such a hot button issue over the next 5 years, what needs to happen?
Oh, that's a difficult question, Jim. I don't think one single thing, probably a couple of things. First, permitting reform. It will alleviate the burden off of a lot of people's mind, a lot of stakeholders' mind. Two is we really need some reform in our grid. Both the interconnection. I would say interconnection is your keyword, both on the generation side, connecting to generation sources and to large load customers. Um, I think those would be two key aspects: permitting reform and international interconnection pipelines.